says preparing to live stream the meeting.
Meeting is now streaming live on YouTube.
Hello, Sarmite. Good morning.
Hello, Shahar. Good morning.
It's a pleasure for me to host you here at the Rethinking Plastic talks. As part of the Dutch Design Week program, we're curating for a Rethinking Plastic exhibition here at DXC in Eindhoven. Sarmite, she's a friend of mine and a colleague, so it's a double pleasure. You're participating in our exhibition with your project
Pine Resin.
Yes, which is very beautiful material research. I recently listened to your other presentation that took place during Dutch Design Week as well, and it's extremely fascinating to hear you present your work. So I think we'll just go into it. If you can share your screen.
Thank you very much for the nice intro. I'm also very happy to participate at the Rethinking Plastic exhibition because it's the first time I'm showing the project in public. And yeah, I will happily tell you more about it. I will share my screen, and I think now you should see a full screen.
Yeah, it works.
So
I put myself on mute.
Yes, it is already. So I found this photo recently in my archive, and that brought me back to my memories from 2015 when I worked on my graduation project at the Design Academy Eindhoven while investigating the byproducts of the pine tree. And already then I was working with pine resin and looking ways on how to increase the properties of the material. So by adding beeswax and glycerin and natural glues, I tried to make the material stronger. But it's been actually only the last 2 to 3 years where this project took a bigger importance in my work. And that's what brought to the project what it is now. And I will happily tell you about it and also what led to it. I call myself a material and product designer because my work lies between those two worlds. For me, material is a storyteller, while the product itself is the carrier. And the material is always a starting point and a very important ingredient for me, but it is also a small ingredient in this complex map where to understand the material, you need to look at the history of it, at the context of what it was used, what role did it play, and what is its relationships to other species, such as us humans, for example. And by drawing this kind of a map creates a unique portrait of each material. And from then on, we can start shaping the material through traditional techniques combined with experimentation and new technologies. So in my long-term projects, I'm busy with redesigning the pine tree as such. But in fact, it's not about the wood or the timber of the pine tree. I'm investigating the tree cutting industry that has all the focus on timber only. And I'm looking for ways how to change it, how other parts of the pine tree could become equally important. Because currently timber defines the whole process of the tree cutting industry, from how trees are grown, how trees are cut. And I think that is an insult to the forest itself and also to the rest of the tree, such as the bark, the needles, all the sawdust and everything that is left in the forest after the tree itself is gone. And that goes to an extent where trees are not seen anymore as living beings, but rather as growing cubic meters of timber. So when I read about this fact during my graduation project, I thought, wow, that's interesting. So if we don't see trees anymore, as living trees, then let's embrace it and let's see what new realities can come out of it. So I started to look at the tree as an animal itself and compare it to the animal industry. And by taking this lens, I suddenly realized that the skin of the tree, which is the bark, it actually has almost no uses at all. So what if I could create these new uses? I started harvesting bark from dead trees that I found around Eindhoven. And then by experimenting with the bark and finding ways how to soften it and keep it soft for over long periods of time, I came to this material that felt like leather but smelled like wood. This is a video of me harvesting a little piece of bark. So yeah, over time, I learned to harvest the pieces bigger and bigger and develop it further. And while the actual graduation project consisted of this collection of 4 objects that all together made the amount of bark that can be harvested from a single pine tree. And with this, I wanted to make a statement of how much material would there be actually available to use if we change the ways we harvest trees and we cut trees. So what started as a speculation project continued as a business idea. And ever since graduating, I've been busy in developing the material further, making collaborations with tree cutters, improving the qualities of the material and seeing what applications can come out of it. But it definitely has limitations in terms of availability in nature. So therefore, the pine skins could never really become a mass-produced product as such. And perhaps it shouldn't, not every material should become a mass-produced material. So while working with the material, I never really threw out any of it. I kept all the off-cuttings and the leftovers, which very fast started to pile up in my studio. So I realized that I need to do something with them, but I also felt very bad to throw them just out because I've been working so hard to create this material at first place. So I started to think of another scale of bark that would allow me to use all the leftovers. I then grinded the bark down to this grain consistency and looked for ways that I could combine it. So then again, pine resin came into my mind because I had worked already with it in 2015 at the Design Academy. And while then it didn't work to achieve what I wanted with the natural glues and with the pine wax, not pine wax, beeswax, I then realized that perhaps the bark is the answer. And I also like the idea of creating a new material that consists only of the same tree. All the parts are always mixed differently together, and all of the parts are the byproduct of the tree cutting industry. And with this, I can make a further statement about how many more materials are there available, because it is about making new material relationships from those parts of the tree that are actually left there after the tree itself has been cut. So I started to experiment with different ingredients, such as sawdust, the thick parts of the bark, and charcoal, and making small material samples. And that also took the longest period of time, because when you introduce different ingredients, you first need to understand what they should be, then what they do exactly to the composite material, and how much do you need of them. So finding different ratios, finding the balance between the strength of the material, thickness and thinness. So the resulting material is this glass-like composite material that is a bioplastic. So that being a bioplastic, that means that it can be shaped while it's hot. And that period is pretty short. So I also needed to make my own production tools that would allow me to shape the material while it's hot. And there I had lots of failure and trial, which always brought me to new learnings. And I think now, having done so many experiments, I finally know a way how I can achieve the results that I want. Being a bioplastic, it also means that all the experiments I ever create, I can always remelt them and mold it into a new vase. So I never lose really the material, and therefore I don't create new waste. So with the collection of vases that I created for the Rethinking Plastic, I wanted to show how the different ingredients and different recipes can create nuances in terms of structure and color. Some of these vases are quite smooth and glass-like, whereas some of them are quite rough, and that all depends on the ingredients that are inside it. I also wanted to show how the ingredient itself can become the main carrier. If you look at the yellow vases, which are pure pine resin, they're very beautiful, but pine resin as such is very fragile, but it's very pretty. And every time during the last years, when I touched the pine resin as such, and when I posted something on social media, people were very interested. They're like, wow, what is this? What are you making with it? And I'm like, it's so fragile, I can't make anything with it. And then there was a period where I thought, perhaps I'm stretching the sustainability too far. And what if I use the pine resin as an inspiration? But I actually produce this glass-like earthy yellow translucent material from a convenient resin such as epoxy. So I tried that, and guess what? I hated it. I hated the whole process, from getting the epoxy to mixing it to casting it to the last result. It was so fake. It was what I wanted, right? A translucent glass-like material, but it lacked the whole story about the material. And that's why I love working with materials, because they bring the story of the material. They tell where the material actually comes from, and therefore what it means. So this experiment became a very quick lesson of, if you work with natural materials and raw materials, then either you accept them as they are and embrace it, or you leave it. So that learning brought me further to think, okay, the fragility of pine resin comes in the package of the material, and I can't change it, because then it's not it anymore. So what if I balance that with the thickness of the material? So imagine a vase that would actually be very, very thick, because that's how it holds the fragility, or that's how it makes the material stronger. And then me as a designer or producer, if I sell such a vase to a consumer and it breaks, I can always remelt it and make it into the same vase and return it. I think as designers, we need to think more of how our products also die and what happens afterwards they die. And if we create a relationship with consumers where we also repair the things and we return to them, that creates a new relationship between consumers and their products. So the next step for the project is to make the material waterproof with natural ways, and find a partner that would help me with production techniques and increase the properties of the material further, so to make it more stable. And from then on, just see what other applications could the material take place, and how big would it allow to grow by taking into account the availability of the material again. I've been also experimenting, instead of pine resin, cellulose as a binder, because it is also a byproduct of trees, not necessarily pine tree only. And in that case, it creates a material that is less glass-like, but more plastic-like. So that's also something interesting. And in fact, for the very first time, I have stepped out of the realm of the pine tree and have entered the world of textile waste. And it's a project where we have been investigating what is textile per definition, and how far can we stretch the concept. And by that, can we turn textile waste into something valuable and bring it back to the fashion market. So yeah, that was my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It was extremely fascinating. And I was immediately thinking, like, we're both working in this, in the same field. And I think we're both encountering the same problems. And a lot of times, and you said it correctly, that material designers, and especially now that we want to focus on sustainability because it's such an important subject, we need sometimes to compromise and find like our way of like not compromising on aesthetic, not compromising on the story, but we are working with materials that they have their own characteristic and their own personality. So how hard is it to find the balance between what you want to tell, the honesty, also of the material, and keeping it sustainable?
Exactly. I find it very hard, and it also changes all the time. By making one thing, I learn something new about the material or about the technique as such, and then next time I can elaborate then again on my own iteration, and it's like a continuous dialogue between me and the material.
Yeah, definitely. I can really relate. And also another question, because you worked also with tree cutters.
Yes.
And was it hard to approach them as a designer, as somebody like from a different background with a different set of mind? And how did you approach them? How did you work together with them and made them excited as you are about this project?
Yeah, I realized quite early that I need more access to trees because I'm not going to harvest trees on the bark from living trees. So I come from a small village in Latvia, and I got to know a tree cutter through some friends. So I approached him. He's a quite old man, around 70, and I approached him just like that, saying that, I'm a design student and I investigate this bark. And he's like, bark? And but then through dialogue and like showing him the small pieces I have made already, he was like, well, you can come with me to the forest. So it was all about showing persistence and then showing what I'm doing, and which also brought me to progress. So while in the beginning I could harvest small pieces that grew a bit bigger, and then at the point where I could take bark from a whole tree in one piece, there was also a moment for him where he realized like, oh, okay, this is going somewhere. So I think while in the beginning he didn't completely understand what I was doing, but he kind of trusted me because he wanted to help me. And in the end, he saw value in it. And then I constantly would keep him updated about the process. And then I also see that he's way more interested in it. And I still keep collaborating with this particular tree cutter. He's a small scale forest owner and tree cutter. So every spring I go to Latvia and we would go together. He would cut the trees that he has to cut already anyway, and I would harvest the bark in the meanwhile. So at this point, he already, when he sees some pine trees, he already says that he will just keep them for me for the springtime, because that seems like some good trees to harvest bark from. But indeed, it is an interesting dialogue to have to people who never saw any value to the bark, to show them that by taking care and by changing the way you look at the bark, it can suddenly become a value. I really enjoyed that process. But at the same time, I also have tried approaching larger companies that cut a lot of trees. There would be just so much material to harvest. But the problem is that their way of working is very, very focused on timber. So they have these huge machines that cut the trees really, really fast. They shred all the branches and everything off, and the timber is ready and cut already in the right sizes. But that gives me very little freedom to actually do my work. Therefore, the small scale tree cutters are more open to changing their ways or adjusting their ways of how they cut the tree, where do they let the tree fall, and at which point do they collect again the cut trees. And I realized over time that I also like working with them more because they face more the problems around tree cutting comparing to the large companies.
Yeah, I think it's maybe for everybody who's going to watch this video or watching it now, I think it's maybe important if you have some kind of a tip, because I understand that usually, for us designers, it's easier to work with the small scale people that are more open to experiment, and they don't have only profit in their mind. But how can we change this? Because I feel that a lot of times there's this place that we can't bridge between the one designer, the one independent designer, and the big companies. Do you have any ideas how we can do that?
I agree with you. I feel like the easiest is to make the change within my own, studio, and then the next level would be make a change within a small company. And the hardest is to make a change within a big company. And that is also something that I'm very occupied with, because I feel like we have to reach further out. We have to make a change on a larger scale with those larger companies. But I think that by going on with our practice and showing these alternative methods and also proposing alternative methods, by finding the people who will eventually listen to us, it can slowly take place.
Definitely, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it's something that I think it's very important for designers and especially individual designers that we're facing this huge forces, and how can we bring our change as individuals. And I think through materials and through talking about important issues as sustainability, we can maybe create change and hopefully in the future.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also, because you said you come from a small village in Latvia and you're working with trees already for 5 years.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a story, like a personal story. How, what is your relationship with the trees since when you were in Latvia, even?
It was something very unconscious that I came to the realization that trees have always been around me. I chose the tree quite naturally, simply because the pine tree is one of the most common trees in Latvia, and also one of the most industrialized trees within the tree cutting industry. But then when I realized that as a child, I also lived on a street that was called the Needle Street, like Pine Needle Street. And I had lots of pine needles around our house where I really played a lot of times. So that's why the tree itself is very personal to me, because I have had a lot of relationship that unconsciously, apparently, I have brought with me further in life. And also because it's a tree that has so many layers to it. It seems so rough on the ground layer, but when you go further up the tree, it actually becomes very, very flake-like, silky-like, and it has these color nuances. So for me, it's a very interesting tree with so many faces that it can have, and that's why through design I also try to show these different faces.
Yeah, great. And did you also try different trees, or you immediately went to the pine that was like immediate choice, or you tried different things?
The pine tree was the immediate choice, also because there are just so many pine trees being cut. Whereas I have also later on tried it with different trees, but there are much fewer of them. So if I would go with a tree cutter to the forest, the majority would be pine trees, and maybe then one would be another species where I could harvest the bark, but it would be too little for me to make something stable out of it. I've also tried in Netherlands the same process with another tree. I think it was the cedar that had bark that was a lot thicker, but it had a lemon scent, citrus scent smell, and that was very, very beautiful, because I thought, how beautiful would it be to have a rug made of a tree that smells of citrus and such. Yeah. But that has stayed only at that level.
And also, like, maybe you can tell also a little bit, like, because you're focusing on the cutting, but this cutting is also, I guess, is stimulating people also to plant more trees, right?
Yeah. The context that I use for understanding the tree cutting industry mainly comes from Latvia, and there the system of the forest management is that within a certain period of time in a year, certain amount of trees have to be cut, and once those are cut, the new ones are planted. But this is only a system that they have in Latvia, whereas, for example, in Germany here they have I think a different kind of system where they plant trees more often than cutting, because I know that the forest area in Germany has grown a lot more in the last years. Then again, in Scandinavia, the system again is completely different.
So it really depends on the politics and what is the decision per country.
It is, and that is also the main reason to make the timber industry more balanced in terms of using also other parts. It is a dialogue that should happen between the forest industry and the government and the tree cutters. So, as I mentioned, for example, the small tree cutters, they feel the influence of the big tree cutting companies a lot more, because if a huge company comes in the forest, they would completely destroy the fauna of the ground of the forest, of what is there, because they come in with their huge trucks and they just rip everything apart. Whereas a small tree cutter would always be able to to respect more the ground of the forest, the trees that shouldn't be cut around it, which ones to leave and which ones to cut, and do it just in a much more nature-friendlier way.
Yeah.
And so the problem definitely lies in those huge industries and how to change them, because it's so financial, so economy driven that currently timber is the mass exported product.
So for you as a designer, sometimes I think we are facing ethical issues in choosing our materials.
Yes.
Is there like some ethical issues that you discovered through this project, like any materials that you would never work with again because you found out that it's not morally or sustainable driven?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is the pine tree itself. Even though I harvest the bark from trees that are already going to be cut within that year or maybe the next one, the situation is still that when we enter the forest, then the tree cutter allows me to choose the tree. And I feel so bad to choose this tree. I want to, to make a carpet out of it.
It's a little bit like choosing a lobster from an aquarium and then eat it.
Yeah, it is. Then again, if I look at the longer, if I look at within the frame of the year, then I know, okay, the tree will be cut anyway, and then the bark will not be kept at all. But still, it is me who makes a decision in that moment that tree has to be cut. So that is an ethical problem that I face within the moment of tree cutting. Yeah. Also, the resin itself. I'm still investigating into. I mean, at the moment, it also contributes to tree cutting, right? Because it is extracted from living trees as much as I know, mainly. And I want to stay within the framework of how much material is there available, to be considered a byproduct before becoming a new commodity.
Yeah, exactly. That brings me maybe to my next question. How do you see this in the future? Because let's say if all your dreams come true and you'll be able to drive it to a bigger scale, how do you think that you can create control over keeping it sustainable still? Because again, it's economical driven most of the time.
Yeah, I think as long as it works within the small scale tree cutters, because the tree cutter mainly is still interested in timber. He will not change his scope and be like, oh, okay, now I'll also sell this bark, this leathery bark. So his main focus is timber as such, and he can cut only as many trees as the government allows him within a certain period of time. So
it's like hunting for population, for controlling population of certain animals. It's the same in that sense.
Yeah. They wouldn't be able to cut more trees than what is actually allowed, because eventually they also run out of the area of forests they own. The way I would like to scale it up bigger is that it's not me anymore who's so involved in the harvesting and the processing of the bark, but it's the local people. So in that way, I can also offer job opportunities to them and create it more about the society and about the locality of the material as such.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I think we can conclude because we have 2 minutes left. I think it's a really important subject, and you're really doing like the entire picture, which I personally, as a designer, as a material designer, really, really happy to hear, because a lot of times I think in the material design field, we're losing looking at the entire picture when we're doing research. And it's really important to look also at the geopolitics of materials and the story they can tell us. So thank you very much for joining today and telling your story.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And everybody's welcome to come and see your beautiful project at the Rethinking Plastic exhibition. I think you're staying until March, right?
I think so.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You too.